Jake Thompson woke up every morning to the sound of roosters crowing in the distance. His small wooden house sat at the edge of town, where the pavement ended and dirt roads began. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the roof had a few loose shingles that rattled when the wind blew hard. But it was home. At 19 years old, Jake had calloused hands and sun-darkened skin from working outside every day. He wasn't the tallest guy around, but he was strong from hauling hay bales and fixing fences. His brown hair was always a little messy, and his old work boots had holes that he patched with duct tape. Jake lived with his mother, Betty, who worked as a seamstress in town. She spent her days hunched over an old sewing machine, mending clothes, for neighbors who couldn't afford to buy new ones. The money she made was barely enough to pay for groceries and keep the lights on. Some months they had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying medicine for Betty's arthritis. The most valuable thing Jake owned was his grandfather's donkey, Buster. The gray donkey had been with the family for 8 years now. Grandpa, Joe, had left Buster to Jake before he passed away, saying the animal would be good company and could help earn a few dollars here and there. Buster wasn't the prettiest donkey in Texas. His ears were too big for his head, and he had a stubborn streak that could test anyone's patience. Sometimes he would just stop walking in the middle of a job and refuse to move, no matter how much Jake coaxed him. But Buster was loyal and hard-working when he wanted to be. Every week, Jake would load up Buster with tools and walk from farm to farm, looking for work. He helped farmers move heavy equipment, carried supplies to hard-to-reach places, and sometimes used Buster to pull small carts loaded with vegetables to the local market. The pay was never much, maybe $20 or $30 for a full day's work, but it was honest money. Jake's reputation in their small farming community was solid gold. When Mrs. Patterson's old truck broke down during harvest season, Jake spent 3 days helping her move corn by hand, using Buster to carry the heavy sacks. He didn't ask for extra pay, even though it meant missing other jobs that week. When the Johnson family's fence got knocked down by a storm, Jake showed up the next morning with wire and tools, working until sunset to get their cattle secured again. Mr. Johnson tried to pay him extra, but Jake just smiled and said the regular rate was fine. The local diner owner, Ruth, always saved Jake a free cup of coffee when he came to town. She'd watch him through the window, walking alongside Buster down the main street, and shake her head at how polite he was to everyone he met. Even the grumpiest old-timers in town had good things to say about Betty Thompson's boy. Jake never thought much about his reputation. He was just doing what felt right. His mother had raised him to believe that helping others was simply what decent people did. Betty would often tell him stories about how his grandfather had been the same way, always lending a hand, never expecting anything in return. One evening, as Jake was brushing down Buster after a long day of helping a neighbor repair his barn, his mother came out to the small shed where they kept the donkey. She moved slowly, her joints aching from another day bent over her sewing machine. "You know, son," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." Jake looked up from Buster's coat, which he was carefully cleaning with an old brush. "I'm just trying to do right, Mama, like you taught me." Betty smiled, the kind of smile that reached her tired eyes. "That's exactly what I mean. In this world, there's too many people looking out only for themselves, but you see someone who needs help and you don't even think twice about it." Jake went back to brushing Buster, not sure what to say. He'd never thought of his actions as anything special. When he saw someone struggling, helping just seemed like the natural thing to do. "I remember when you were little," Betty continued, "maybe 7 or 8 years old. You came home one day with only one shoe. I asked you what happened to the other one, and you told me you gave it to a boy at school whose shoe had a big hole in it. You walked home barefoot on that gravel road, just so another kid wouldn't have to." Jake had forgotten about that day, but now he remembered the feel of the small rocks under his feet and how his mother had hugged him extra tight that evening. "The thing is," Betty said, "you never expected anything back then, and you don't expect anything now. That's a rare quality, Jake. Don't ever lose it." As his mother headed back to the house, Jake finished taking care of Buster and looked around their small property. The fence needed painting, the shed roof had a leak, and their old pickup truck was making strange noises again. Money was always tight, and sometimes Jake wondered if they'd ever get ahead. But looking at Buster, who was now munching contentedly on some hay, Jake felt grateful for what they had. They might not have much, but they had each other. They had their health, and they had the respect of their neighbors. In a small farming community, that respect meant something. Jake didn't know it yet, but his reputation for kindness and reliability had spread further than he realized. People 3 towns over had heard about the Thompson boy who would drop everything to help a neighbor. Store owners mentioned him when customers were looking for reliable help. Church congregations included him in their prayers. As Jake locked up the shed and headed toward the house where he could smell his mother's cornbread baking in the oven, he had no idea that his simple way of living was about to change everything. Tomorrow would start like any other day, checking on Buster, looking for work, and helping whoever needed it. But sometimes the most ordinary days can lead to the most extraordinary changes. And for Jake Thompson, that change was coming sooner than he could ever imagine. The summer heat that year was brutal. By mid-July, the temperature was hitting over 100 degrees every single day. The grass had turned brown, and even the toughest farmers were struggling to keep their crops alive. Jake had been working extra hours, helping neighbors move irrigation equipment and repair water pumps that kept breaking down from overuse. On this particular Tuesday morning, Jake set out early with Buster to help old Mr. Crawford fix a broken gate about 5 miles outside of town. The sun was already burning hot at 7 in the morning, and Jake knew it was going to be a scorcher. He packed extra water for both himself and Buster, along with some tools and a few apples for the donkey. The dirt road to Crawford's place wound through some of the most remote farmland in the county. There were long stretches where you wouldn't see another soul for miles. Jake enjoyed these quiet walks, listening to the crunch of gravel under his boots and Buster's hooves, watching hawks circle overhead in the clear blue sky. About halfway to Crawford's farm, Jake noticed something up ahead on the side of the road. At first he thought it might be a pile of old clothes someone had dumped, but as he got closer he realized it was a person lying in the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree. Jake's heart started beating faster. He picked up his pace, leading Buster toward the figure. As they approached, Jake could see it was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, wearing a nice button-down shirt and dress pants that were now covered in dust. The man's face was red from the heat, and he was breathing heavily. "Sir? Sir, are you okay?" Jake called out as he jogged the last few yards. The old man's eyes fluttered open. They were a sharp blue but clouded with confusion and exhaustion. He tried to sit up but couldn't quite manage it. "Water," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake immediately grabbed his water bottle and knelt down beside the stranger. He helped lift the man's head and gave him small sips of water, being careful not to let him drink too fast. "Easy now," Jake said gently. "Just take it slow." The man drank gratefully, some color returning to his pale face. After a few minutes, he was able to sit up with Jake's help. "Thank you," the man said, his voice stronger now. "I don't know what happened. I was walking and then I just couldn't go any further." Jake looked around and spotted an expensive-looking car about a quarter-mile down the road, pulled off to the side with its hood up. "Is that your car, sir?" The man nodded weakly. "Broke down about an hour ago. I started walking toward town, but—" He gestured helplessly at the blazing sun overhead. Jake did some quick math in his head. The nearest town was at least 12 miles away. In this heat, that was a dangerous walk for anyone, especially a man this age. "What's your name, sir?" Jake asked, giving the man more water. "Samuel Morrison," the man replied. "I was heading to look at some property when my car just died on me." Jake had never heard the name before, but that wasn't unusual. Lots of people passed through their area on business. "Well, Mr. Morrison, we need to get you to a doctor. This heat can be deadly." Samuel tried to stand up, but his legs were shaky. "I can walk," he insisted, though it was clear he couldn't. Jake looked at Buster, who was standing patiently nearby, occasionally swishing his tail at flies. The donkey had carried plenty of heavy loads before, and while he might not like it, he could definitely carry a passenger. "Sir, I've got a better idea," Jake said. "My donkey here can carry you to town. It's not the most comfortable ride, but it's better than trying to walk in this heat." Samuel's eyes widened. "Oh no, I couldn't take your animal. You probably need him for work." "Right now, getting you help is more important than any work," Jake replied. He was already moving toward Buster, checking the donkey's blanket and makeshift saddle. "But you don't even know me," Samuel protested. "I'm just a stranger who made a foolish mistake." Jake paused and looked at the older man. "Mr. Morrison, my mama always taught me that there ain't no such thing as strangers, just neighbors we haven't met yet. And neighbors help neighbors." Samuel stared at Jake for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "What's your name, son?" "Jake Thompson, sir." "Well, Jake Thompson, I appreciate your kindness more than you know. But I insist on paying you for this." Jake was already helping Samuel to his feet. "We can talk about that later, sir. Right now, let's focus on getting you somewhere safe." Getting Samuel onto Buster took some effort. The donkey, true to his nature, was not thrilled about carrying a passenger he didn't know. But after some gentle coaxing from Jake and a few apple slices, Buster grudgingly accepted his new burden. The journey to town was slow and careful. Jake walked alongside Buster, one hand on the donkey's lead rope and the other ready to steady Samuel if needed. The sun climbed higher and hotter as they traveled, and Jake found himself sweating through his work shirt. Every few minutes, Jake would check on Samuel, offering him water and asking how he was feeling. The older man seemed amazed by Jake's concern, as if he wasn't used to people going out of their way to help him. "You're missing work for this," Samuel observed after they'd been walking for about an hour. "Mr. Crawford will understand," Jake replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He's a good man. He'd do the same thing if he were in my shoes." "Still, this is costing you money." Jake shrugged. "Some things are more important than money, sir." As they walked, Samuel began asking Jake questions about his life, his family, and his work. Jake answered honestly, talking about his mother's sewing business, their small house, and how he made a living helping neighbors with odd jobs. He mentioned his grandfather and how Buster had been in the family for years. What struck Samuel most was Jake's complete lack of complaint about his circumstances. The young man spoke about his modest life with contentment, even pride. He clearly loved his mother, respected his neighbors, and took satisfaction in honest work. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, Samuel had learned more about Jake's character than many people reveal in years of friendship. He watched as Jake patiently guided Buster through the busy streets, apologizing to drivers who had to wait while they crossed intersections, and greeting everyone they passed with a friendly wave. At the doctor's office, Jake helped Samuel down from Buster and made sure he got inside safely. The doctor immediately began treating Samuel for heat exhaustion, praising Jake for getting the man to medical attention quickly. "You probably saved his life," Dr. Martinez told Jake quietly while Samuel was resting in the examination room. As Jake prepared to leave with Buster, Samuel called him back. The older man reached for his wallet, pulling out several $100 bills. "Please take this," Samuel insisted. "It's the least I can do." Jake held up his hands, backing away from the money. "No, sir, I can't take that. I'm just glad you're okay." "But you gave up your whole day, walked 12 miles in this heat." "Mr. Morrison," Jake said with a genuine smile, "I was just helping. A neighbor. That's what people do around here. You get better now and maybe we'll see each other again sometime." With that, Jake tipped his hat and walked out of the doctor's office, leading Buster back toward home. Behind him, Samuel Morrison sat in stunned silence, staring at the money still in his hands. In all his 73 years, Samuel had never encountered someone who would refuse payment for such an extraordinary act of kindness. As he watched Jake disappear down the street, Samuel Morrison began to think this chance encounter might be the most important meeting of his entire life. After Jake left the doctor's office that day, he put the encounter with Samuel Morrison behind him and went back to his normal routine. He still had Mr. Crawford's gate to fix, so he headed straight there, even though the afternoon heat was getting worse. Crawford was understanding about the delay and even praised Jake for helping a stranger in need. But while Jake went about his regular life, Samuel Morrison was far from forgetting what had happened. After the doctor cleared him and arranged for his car to be towed and repaired, Samuel didn't immediately leave town. Instead, he checked into the local motel and began doing something he rarely did anymore: He started paying attention to a small community. Samuel Morrison was not just any elderly man with car trouble. He was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the entire state of Texas, though he lived quietly and most people wouldn't recognize him on the street. Over the past 50 years, he had built an empire of cattle ranches, oil wells, and farmland that stretched across 3 counties. His total worth was estimated at somewhere around $40 million. Samuel had grown up poor, the son of a sharecropper, and he had clawed his way to wealth through hard work, smart investments, and some would say ruthless business practices. He had learned early that most people were only kind to him when they wanted something from him. Trust had become a luxury he couldn't afford, but what Jake had done that day bothered Samuel in the best possible way. Here was a young man who had nothing, who had sacrificed his time and money to help a complete stranger, and who had refused payment for his kindness. In Samuel's experience, such people simply didn't exist. Samuel had never married and had no children. For years he had been quietly wondering what would happen to his vast holdings when he passed away. He had distant relatives who barely knew him, and he had no desire to leave his life's work to people who would probably just sell everything off for quick cash. So Samuel decided to investigate. He wanted to learn more about Jake Thompson and see if the young man's kindness had been genuine or just an elaborate setup of some kind. The next morning, Samuel walked into Ruth's Diner, the heart of gossip and information in any small town. He ordered coffee and struck up conversations with the locals, carefully asking questions about the community without mentioning Jake specifically. "Nice little town you have here," Samuel said to Ruth as she refilled his coffee cup. "Oh, it is," Ruth replied warmly. "People look out for each other around here, always have." "That's rare these days," Samuel observed. "Maybe in the big cities," said an old farmer sitting at the counter, "but folks here still believe in doing right by your neighbors." Samuel spent the morning listening to stories about community barn raisings, neighbors helping neighbors through tough times, and young people who still respected their elders. He was beginning to think Jake might not be so unusual in this particular place, but then Ruth mentioned something that caught his attention. "Like yesterday," she said, wiping down the counter. "Betty Thompson's boy Jake gave up a whole day's work to help some stranger who broke down on the old county road. Carried the man 12 miles on his donkey in 100-degree heat." The old farmer nodded approvingly. "That sounds like Jake. That boy would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it." "His grandfather was the same way," added another customer. "Joe Thompson never met a person he wouldn't help. Jake's got the same heart." Samuel's interest was definitely piqued now. He asked casual questions about the Thompson family and learned about Jake's mother working as a seamstress, their modest circumstances, and Jake's reputation around town. "Let me tell you about Jake Thompson," the old farmer said, settling in for a longer story. "Last winter, the Wilson family's house caught fire, lost everything. Jake showed up the next morning with every tool he owned and spent 3 weeks helping rebuild that house. Didn't charge them a penny, even though he was missing other paying jobs." Ruth nodded. "And when Mrs. Patterson's husband died last spring, Jake spent every evening for a month helping her learn how to manage the farm, taught her how to fix equipment, helped her understand the books, made sure she could keep the place running. Never asks for anything extra." Another customer chimed in. "Fair price for fair work, and sometimes won't even take that if he thinks people are struggling." Samuel listened to story after story about Jake's character. The young man had apparently been helping people around the community for years, always quietly, never seeking recognition or special treatment. Over the next few days, Samuel extended his stay at the motel and continued his investigation. He visited the bank and spoke with the loan officer about local families. He talked to the pastor at the local church, the principal at the high school, and several business owners in town. Every single person had the same thing to say about Jake Thompson. He was honest, hardworking, and generous to a fault. Even more importantly, nobody could remember him ever asking for anything in return for his help. Samuel also learned more about the Thompson family's circumstances. Betty Thompson was well respected but struggling financially. Her arthritis was getting worse, making it harder for her to work long hours at her sewing machine. Jake was essentially supporting both of them on whatever odd jobs he could find, and money was clearly tight. "That boy works harder than men twice his age," the bank officer told Samuel. "Never missed a payment on anything, even when I know they're eating beans and rice for dinner. Too proud to ask for help, but first in line to help everyone else." Samuel visited the local mechanic who had towed his car and learned another interesting detail. Jake had stopped by to check on the repair progress. Not for Samuel, but because he was worried about how the elderly man would get his car back. "Kid, didn't even know I had your car here," the mechanic said. "Just heard from someone that an older fellow had broken down and he wanted to make sure everything worked out okay. That's just how he is." By the end of the week, Samuel had built a complete picture of Jake Thompson's character. This wasn't a young man putting on an act or looking for an angle. This was someone who genuinely cared about others and lived his life according to principles that Samuel had almost forgotten existed. But Samuel needed one more test. He had learned that Jake often helped at the local farmers market on weekends, using Buster to transport goods for elderly vendors who had trouble carrying heavy items. Samuel decided to observe Jake in action. On Saturday morning, Samuel positioned himself at the market and watched Jake work. The young man arrived early with Buster and immediately began helping vendors set up their stalls. He carried heavy boxes, set up tables, and made sure everyone had what they needed. What impressed Samuel most was watching Jake interact with customers. When an elderly woman realized she had forgotten her wallet, Jake quietly paid for her groceries from his own pocket. When a young mother's child dropped an ice cream cone, Jake bought a replacement without being asked. Throughout the morning, Jake never stopped moving. He helped customers carry purchases to their cars, assisted vendors with restocking, and even swept up trash that other people had dropped. And he did all of this with a genuine smile, clearly enjoying the opportunity to be useful. Samuel also noticed that several people tried to give Jake tips for his help, and he politely refused every single one. "Just happy to help," Jake would say, and Samuel could tell he meant it. By noon, Samuel had seen enough. He had spent over a week investigating Jake Thompson, and everything he had discovered pointed to the same conclusion. This young man possessed a rare combination of integrity, generosity, and genuine kindness that Samuel had never encountered in all his years of business. That evening, Samuel sat in his motel room and made a decision that would change everything. He picked up the phone and called his lawyer in Houston. "Richard," Samuel said when his attorney answered, "I need you to draft a new will, and I need you to do it immediately." "Of course, Mr. Morrison. What changes would you like to make?" Samuel looked out his motel window toward the part of town where Jake Thompson lived with his mother in their small house. "I want to leave everything to a young man named Jake Thompson," Samuel said. "Everything. The ranches, the oil rights, the farmland, all of it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, who is Jake Thompson? I don't recall that name from any of our previous discussions." Samuel smiled, thinking about the young man who had refused payment for saving his life. "He's someone who still believes in doing the right thing," Samuel replied. "And that's exactly the kind of person who should inherit what I've built." 3 months had passed since Jake's encounter with Samuel Morrison, and life had settled back into its familiar rhythm. Jake continued his rounds of odd jobs, helping neighbors and earning just enough to keep food on the table and the lights on. His mother's arthritis had been acting up more lately, which meant fewer hours at her sewing machine and less money coming in. Jake had picked up extra work wherever he could find it, sometimes putting in 14-hour days to make up the difference. Buster, his faithful donkey, had been working overtime too, helping transport supplies and equipment for farmers preparing for the fall harvest. On this particular Wednesday morning in October, Jake was out in the small shed behind their house, trying to patch a leak in the roof before the next rain. His mother was inside, taking a break from her sewing to rest her swollen joints. The morning was quiet, except for the sound of Jake hammering and the distant lowing of cattle from a neighboring farm. The sound of a car pulling into their driveway was unusual. They rarely had visitors, especially ones driving expensive-looking vehicles. Jake climbed down from the ladder and walked around to the front of the house, wiping his hands on an old rag. A well-dressed man in a dark suit was getting out of a black sedan. He carried a leather briefcase and had the confident walk of someone used to handling important business. Jake had never seen him before. "Are you Jake Thompson?" the man asked, extending his hand. "Yes, sir, that's me," Jake replied, shaking the stranger's hand despite his own being dirty from roof work. "My name is Richard Preston. I'm an attorney from Houston. I wonder if I could speak with you and your mother for a few minutes. It's regarding the estate of Samuel Morrison." Jake's face showed confusion. "Samuel Morrison? I met someone by that name a few months back, but I don't understand what you mean about an estate. May we go inside? This is rather important, and I think you'll want to sit down for this conversation." Jake called for his mother, who came to the door wiping her hands on her apron. Betty looked worried. In their experience, visits from lawyers usually meant bad news. They sat around the small kitchen table where Jake and his mother ate their meals every day. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. "Mr. Thompson," Richard began, "I'm here to inform you that Samuel Morrison passed away 2 weeks ago from a heart attack. He was 73 years old." Jake's face fell. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. He seemed like a good man when I met him, but I'm not sure why you're telling me this." Richard smiled slightly. "Because Mr. Thompson, Mr. Morrison left his entire estate to you in his will." The kitchen fell completely silent. Jake and his mother stared at the lawyer as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry," Jake said slowly, "but I think there's been some mistake. I only met Mr. Morrison once for maybe 2 hours total. He couldn't have left me anything." "There's no mistake," Richard assured him. "Mr. Morrison was very specific in his instructions. He left you his ranch, properties which total approximately 15,000 acres across 3 counties. He also left you the mineral rights to those properties, including several active oil wells. Additionally, there are various bank accounts, investment portfolios, and other assets." Betty Thompson's hand flew to her mouth. "How much are we talking about here?" she whispered. Richard consulted his documents. "The total value of the estate is estimated at approximately $42 million. Jake stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. $42 million? That's not possible. There has to be some kind of mistake." "I understand this is shocking," Richard said calmly. "But I assure you, everything is legally binding and properly documented. Mr. Morrison spent considerable time making sure his will was ironclad." Jake began pacing around the small kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "But why me? I don't understand. I just helped the man when his car broke down. Anyone would have done the same thing." According to Mr. Morrison's notes, Richard said, reading from a document, "He spent several weeks investigating your character after your encounter. He was particularly impressed by what he called your uncommon integrity and selfless nature. He believed you were the right person to inherit his life's work." Betty was crying now, but they were tears of disbelief rather than sadness. "Jake, honey, this means we'll never have to worry about money again. We can fix the house, get proper medical care for my arthritis, maybe even buy a new truck." But Jake wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about responsibility. "Mr. Preston, what exactly am I inheriting? I mean, what am I supposed to do with 15,000 acres and oil wells? I don't know anything about running a big ranch." "That's actually addressed in Mr. Morrison's notes as well," Richard replied. "He expected you might feel overwhelmed, so he made arrangements. The ranch currently employs about 30 people, including an experienced foreman named Tom Rodriguez, who has been managing day-to-day operations for over 20 years. Tom has agreed to stay on and help you learn the business." Richard pulled out another set of documents. "Mr. Morrison also established a trust fund to cover operating expenses for the first 2 years, so you won't have to worry about cash flow while you're learning." He thought of everything. Jake sat back down, his head spinning. "This doesn't feel real. Yesterday I was worried about buying groceries, and today you're telling me I'm worth $40 million. "It's very real," Richard confirmed. "But I should mention that Mr. Morrison included a personal letter for you. He wanted you to read it before making any decisions." The lawyer handed Jake a sealed envelope with his name written on it in careful handwriting. Jake's hands were shaking slightly as he opened it. Dear Jake, he read aloud. If you're reading this, then I've passed on, and you're probably feeling confused and overwhelmed. I don't blame you, but I want you to understand why I've chosen you to inherit everything I've worked for during my lifetime. In my 73 years, I've met thousands of people. Most of them wanted something from me. They were polite and helpful only because they hoped to gain something in return. I became wealthy, but I also became cynical about human nature. Then I met you on that hot summer day when my car broke down. You didn't know who I was or what I was worth. You just saw someone who needed help and you gave it freely. More importantly, when I tried to pay you for your kindness, you refused. In all my years of business, no one had ever refused my money. After you left me at the doctor's office, I couldn't stop thinking about what you had done. So I stayed in your town for a week and learned about your life. I discovered that your kindness to me wasn't unusual. It was just who you are. You help people because it's right, not because you expect anything in return. Jake, I never had children of my own, and I've spent years wondering who should inherit the ranch and lands that have been my life's work. I needed someone who would be a good steward of the land and treat the employees fairly. After watching you for that week, I knew I had found that person. Don't feel guilty about accepting this inheritance. You earned it through your character and your actions. The money and property are just tools. What matters is how you use them. I believe you'll use them to help others just like you've been doing your whole life, but now you'll have the means to help on a much larger scale. Take care of the land, take care of the people who work for you, and take care of your mother. She raised a fine son, your friend, Samuel Morrison. By the time Jake finished reading, both he and his mother were crying. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the old clock ticking on the wall. So, Richard said gently, what would you like to do? I need to know if you're accepting the inheritance so we can begin the legal transfer process. Jake looked around their small kitchen, at his mother's worn hands, at the water stain on the ceiling where the roof leaked. Then he thought about Samuel Morrison, a man who had recognized something good in him when Jake couldn't even see it himself. Mr. Preston, Jake said, his voice stronger now, I accept the inheritance, and I promise to do everything I can to honor Mr. Morrison's trust in me. Richard smiled and began pulling out more paperwork. In that case, Mr. Thompson, we have a lot of work to do. Welcome to being one of the wealthiest men in Texas. As Jake began signing documents that would change his life forever, he couldn't help but think about Buster, still out in the shed, probably wondering why his human hadn't brought him his morning apple yet. Some things, Jake decided, weren't going to change at all. The first few weeks after inheriting Samuel Morrison's fortune were the strangest of Jake's life. One day he was patching a roof with duct tape, and the next day he owned more land than he could drive across in a full day. The transition from working for $20 a day to being worth $42 million was almost impossible to wrap his head around. Jake's first decision surprised everyone, including the lawyer. Instead of moving to one of Samuel's grand ranch houses, Jake chose to stay in his small family home while he learned the business. He did use some of the money to fix their roof properly, replace their old truck, and get his mother the medical care she needed for her arthritis. But the basic way they lived didn't change much. We don't need a mansion, Jake told his mother when she suggested they might want to upgrade their living situation. This house has good memories. Let's fix it up nice, but let's stay where we belong. Jake's real education began when he met Tom Rodriguez, the ranch foreman who had been managing Samuel's properties for over 20 years. Tom was a weathered man in his 50s who had started as a cowhand and worked his way up through pure skill and dedication. He had been nervous about meeting the new owner, expecting some city slicker who would want to change everything overnight. Instead, he found Jake waiting for him at the main ranch house at 5 in the morning, wearing his old work boots and asking, "What do we do first?" "Well," Tom said, studying this young man who didn't look like any millionaire he'd ever seen, "first we check on the cattle. You know anything about ranching?" "Nothing at all," Jake admitted honestly. "But I'm here to learn." That honesty was the beginning of a friendship that would shape Jake's entire approach to his new life. Tom became Jake's teacher, and Jake proved to be an eager student. They spent every day together for months, with Tom explaining everything from cattle breeding to land management to oil lease agreements. Jake learned that Samuel Morrison had been a good boss who treated his employees fairly. The ranch hands were skilled, experienced workers who took pride in their jobs. Most had been with the operation for years, and they had been worried about what changes a new owner might bring. Mr. Morrison always said this land would outlast all of us, Tom explained as they rode horses across a vast pasture one morning. He believed in taking care of it so it could take care of future generations. Jake took that philosophy to heart. Instead of making dramatic changes, he focused on learning how Samuel had built such a successful operation. He discovered that his predecessor had been innovative but cautious, always thinking about long-term sustainability rather than quick profits. The oil wells on the property provided steady income, but Jake learned that Samuel had been very selective about drilling. He had turned down many offers from oil companies that wanted to drill extensively, choosing instead to work only with companies that agreed to minimize environmental impact. Money was important to Mr. Morrison, Tom explained, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. He used to say that anyone can make money by destroying something beautiful, but it takes wisdom to make money while protecting it. As Jake grew more comfortable with the business side of ranching, he began to implement some ideas of his own. His first major decision was to increase wages for all the ranch employees. When Tom questioned whether this was financially wise, Jake's response was simple. These people do good work, and they should be paid well for it. Jake also established a scholarship fund for the children of ranch employees who wanted to attend college. He had never forgotten his own struggles with money as a young person, and he wanted to make sure others had opportunities he had never had. But perhaps Jake's most important decision was what to do about Buster. The old donkey had been his faithful companion through all the lean years, and Jake wasn't about to abandon him now that times were good. He built Buster a comfortable paddock near the main ranch house and visited him every day, often bringing apples and spending time brushing the donkey's coat. The ranch hands thought it was a little odd that their wealthy new boss was so attached to an aging donkey, but they came to see it as a sign of Jake's character. A man who stayed loyal to the animal that had helped him through hard times was probably someone they could trust. Word of Jake's good fortune spread through the community, and the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. People who had known him as the helpful young man with the donkey were genuinely happy to see him succeed. There was no jealousy or resentment, just joy that good things had happened to someone who deserved them. Jake used his new resources to help his community in ways both large and small. When the local school needed new computers, Jake quietly donated them. When the church roof needed repair, Jake arranged for it to be fixed. When families were struggling financially, Jake found ways to help without making them feel like charity cases. He also continued doing some of the same work he had always done, just on a larger scale. When neighboring farmers needed help during harvest season, Jake would send ranch hands and equipment to assist. When the local farmers market needed a new building, Jake paid for construction. Betty Thompson watched her son navigate his new life with pride and amazement. The money had changed their circumstances dramatically, but it hadn't changed who Jake was as a person. He was still the same young man who would drop everything to help a neighbor. Just now he had a lot more resources to offer. You know what I'm proudest of? Betty told Jake one evening as they sat on their newly repaired front porch. It's not the money or the land or any of that. It's that you're still the same good-hearted boy I raised. Wealth changes some people, but it just made you more of who you already were. Jake had been thinking about that conversation a year later, when he received some news that hit him hard. Buster, his old companion, was getting sick. The veterinarian said the donkey was simply reaching the end of his natural life. There wasn't anything medically wrong that could be fixed. He was just old and tired. Jake spent Buster's final weeks making sure the donkey was comfortable and surrounded by love. He moved a cot into the barn so he could be nearby if Buster needed anything during the night. Tom and several ranch hands helped care for the animal that had become something of a mascot around the ranch. When Buster finally passed away peacefully on a quiet Sunday morning, Jake grieved like he had lost a family member. In many ways he had. Buster had been his partner through all the difficult years, and now that times were good, Jake wished the donkey could have enjoyed more of the comfort and security. Jake buried Buster on a hillside overlooking the main ranch house, under a large oak tree where the donkey had liked to rest in the shade. He had a simple stone marker made that read, "Buster, a faithful friend who helped change everything." As Jake stood by that grave a few months later, watching the sun set over thousands of acres of land that he still couldn't quite believe belonged to him, he thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. If Buster hadn't been there that hot summer day, Jake couldn't have helped Samuel Morrison. If Jake hadn't helped Samuel, none of this would have happened. "Thank you, old friend," Jake said quietly to the grave marker. "You gave me more than I ever could have imagined." Tom Rodriguez approached from behind, having come to find Jake for the evening ranch report. He stood quietly for a moment, respecting Jake's grief. "You know," Tom said eventually, "Mr. Morrison used to come up here sometimes just to think. He'd stand right about where you are now and look out over the land. I think he'd be proud of what you've done with the place." Jake nodded, still looking out over the vast expanse of grassland and cattle. In the distance, he could see some of his ranch hands heading home after a long day's work, secure in jobs that paid well and treated them fairly. Closer to the house, he could see the lights of the community center he had built, where local families gathered for events and celebrations. "I hope so," Jake replied. "I'm still learning, but I think I'm starting to understand what he meant about being a good steward of the land." As they walked back toward the ranch house together, Jake felt a deep sense of contentment. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, but what made him happiest was knowing that he was using it to take care of people and preserve something beautiful for future generations. The boy who had once worried about buying groceries had become a man who employed dozens of families and supported an entire community. But at heart, he was still the same person who would stop to help a stranger on a hot summer day, still someone who believed that doing right by others was the most important thing in life. Samuel Morrison had been wise to choose Jake Thompson as his heir. The young man had proved that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact you have on the lives of others. And by that measure, Jake Thompson was richer than he had ever dreamed possible.